Now, without further ado, I want to give a formal introduction to our closing keynote speaker, Liesel Mertes. She is an acclaimed workplace empathy expert. Having experienced her own loss and struggle, Liesel emerged with a deep understanding of what employees need to feel supported at work after a disruptive life event. As the founder of Handle with Care, Liesel works with groups that want to boost employee satisfaction, as well as attract and retain better talent. Liesel's favorite clients are forward-thinking organizations who know the value in supporting their employees with empathy and compassion. Her expertise is broad: loss, returning to work, a diagnosis, relationship transitions, and no disruption is considered less significant. On these topics, Liesel is a dedicated speaker, writer, consultant, and host of the Handle with Care podcast. Liesel earned her bachelor's degree in political science and master's degree in business administration, and is currently pursuing studies to obtain a Minister of Divinity. She has worked in Nairobi, consulted in Fiji, and led cohorts in Ghana. Her adventures brought her to Indiana, where she is a proud mother, wife, and lover of time spent on the water. Please help me to welcome my friend Liesel, who's going to take us out today with an incredible message of empathy and compassion in the workplace. Take it away, Liesel.
Hi, my name is Liesel Mertes, and as Nika introduced me, I'm a workplace empathy consultant. And one of the main things that I do is I help to make work a place that people want to come back to in the midst of hard times. And hasn't 2020 been full of what I call disruptive life events? Now, disruptive life events, even if it's not 2020, they sound something like this. They're a relationship transition where someone is dissolving or forming a new intimate attachment. They're a death in the family, a disturbing diagnosis, or circumstances around bringing a child into the home. These are the things that happen even in just more stable years, like 2019, let alone in the widespread chaos that is 2020. And so I want to talk with you some today about what disruptive life events are, how they're affecting your workplace, and how it truly is a diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. Because when you go through something hard and no one knows how to interact with you, no one knows how to come alongside you, or they're manifesting toxic behaviors that help alienate you, it really makes you feel outside of the norm. And those interactions, they look kind of like this. You've probably had some of them this year if you think back onto it. Maybe it's someone telling you the news of their child's COVID diagnosis, or about their partner's loss of a job, or about any of the other hard things that have happened, and you find yourself having no idea of what to do or say, or saying something that you wish you could reel back in and take back. We find ourselves defaulting to these ingrained bad behaviors. And let's face it, I hear this again and again as I talk with prospective clients. Empathy always seems like a great idea for someone else. Empathy can be overwhelming. It can be one of those things that sounds great for someone else. And so many times, really, when we are faced with someone else's disruptive life event, we find ourselves feeling overwhelmed, under-equipped. People are afraid of getting that wrong. Whether it's talking about someone's recent divorce or talking about issues of long-standing systemic racism, we find ourselves defaulting to really ingrained behaviors, wanting to avoid or just completely sidestep the circumstances. So as we talk about empathy today, I want to present it more than anything as a tremendous opportunity. It's an opportunity to differentiate your organization as a place that truly makes space for the holistic individual. It's a place that, as you display empathy, you will actually increase your people's capacity for productivity by letting them know that they're seen and heard. And finally, you're going to be able to create a workplace where people actually want to come to in the midst of hard times. And 2020 is absolutely full of those. And as we begin, it's a good reminder to just revisit this quote: whatever makes you uncomfortable is your biggest opportunity for growth. And especially as I talk with different companies or individuals, lots of people think, empathy, yeah, it sounds good, but it's really outside my wheelhouse. Does this really help our company move forward? Or is it just one of those kind of touchy-feely things that we're supposed to focus on now? And the example that I give them is my Honda Odyssey. That, especially for my stage of life as a mom with 4 young kids, when we got our Honda Odyssey a couple of years ago, it was fantastic. It had all the cup holders, it had all the bells and whistles. We were so delighted to go out and drive it. But we also knew that the wear and tear of any average car, we were going to have to take it in for things like oil changes. We were going to have to pay attention when the light on the dashboard came on and told us that it was time to take it in for a tune-up or a checkup. And if we had just blown through all of those cues and thought, I'm just going to keep driving this car until it can't go anymore, we would have been doing a tremendous disservice to the car and to ourselves. And all too often, what I find in businesses is this is the sort of mindset that people get into. They think, yeah, maybe stuff will go wrong for my people, but I'm just going to ignore it. And I'm going to try to just keep squeezing as much productivity out of them as I can. And frankly, empathy matters. 2020 has elevated that. It matters, and we don't have good systems in place to measure it. We don't build it into our performance reviews, and we end up just hoping and praying for the best and depending on the personalities of maybe 1 or 2 people in the office who we think are good with people, instead of putting plans and systems into place to make sure our people are supported when they need it most. So we've been talking already a little bit, the importance of listening and of empathy. I'm going to introduce you to some empathy avatars. These are some common personality types, these places that individuals tend to go to when dealing with disruption. You will probably identify a former boss, a current coworker, and if you are inclined towards introspection, you will even see yourself within these unhelpful avatars. And I'm going to give you some tips to be aware of to help you better show care and display meaningful words and actions in your workplace. As we said at the start, it is an incredible year. We have coronavirus. We have nationwide protests against systemic and generational injustice towards Black and Brown Americans. If any of you are parents, you know the stress of getting a child ready to go for school in time of coronavirus. Do you have your face mask and your hand sanitizer, or the stress of having a child school from home? We're coming up on the holidays, which is a hard time for anyone who has lost someone this year. And we are in the midst of an absolutely toxic election cycle, which does not look to be concluded 2 weeks from now. We are living with tremendous uncertainty, and it creates a profound sense of being out of control. And within this, empathy is needed. It's needed in the workplace. This is a recent Qualtrics study where 40% of respondents said that throughout the pandemic, they had not even been asked in their workplace how they were doing. 60% of those respondents said that they wanted to be asked about their mental health. And if you're thinking, well, I don't know, maybe isn't this just what HR is supposed to do? This isn't really my thing. In a ranked assessment where people were asked if they wanted to be asked by a coworker, a superior, someone underneath them, someone on the executive team, or HR, the people that they least wanted to reach out to them were HR. The people they most wanted was a coworker or a peer. And this is contributing to a decline in mental health. And it's another thing to be aware of. If you are in a leadership position, you should especially listen. There is the State of Empathy in the Workplace survey that has been conducted over the last 5 years and running. And in the 2020 survey, 76% of employees, people who are working and doing the jobs, said that they believed that empathy was directly tied to productivity. only 50% of CEOs believed this. And again, 70% of employees said that they thought increased empathy led to lower turnover, but only 40% of CEOs agreed. This means that there is potentially a tremendous disconnect between what your people need and what they're saying that they want and what you're actually giving them. And I give out data points. I teach on this. I'm researching, academic papers and reading, but this first came home to me in the realm of personal experience. I felt this disconnect far sooner than I ever studied it. These pictures are from 2011. This is my husband, Luke, and myself, and two of our daughters. The little baby, is a child named Mercy Joan, and she only lived for 8 days in 2011 before she died of a condition called an encephalocele. It is wrenching. If any of you have had a child die, you know the stress and the pain of it. And also, it was an opportunity to realize there were some people who knew how to come alongside me well. I can think I was in the middle of my MBA program, and the people who it just seemed like they knew they knew how to write a card or they knew the right thing to say. And then I just remember being slack-jawed of the people who said the dumbest, most hurtful things. And this sort of a divide has played itself out. Again, my youngest is a little guy named Moses. He's not so little anymore. He's actually 6, but, the baby seems to eternally remain the baby. So he's my little guy, even though he's 6, and he's had to have a number of open heart surgeries. And again, the same sort of a divide of like, wow, some people do this really well, and some people seem to have no idea of what they're doing, was part of what drove me to begin the work that I'm doing. And really, people think that empathy is like this out there thing, like you either have it or you don't. And really, it is a set of skills that if you care enough to learn, they can be taught. It's the foundation of what I do. You can get better at this. Maybe you think, oh, I don't know. I'm not really comfortable with that stuff. You can get better. But before we jump into these, emotional avatars, let's just acknowledge that talking about pain is hard. I would not have a niche or a business if talking about pain was easy and we were all good at it. And it's frankly made harder by the fact that we as Americans are an incredibly grief-adverse society. Like, we have not been raised with the skill set because we are so used to being able to, have things be faster and better. And when we ask you how you're doing, we want you to say, I'm fine, how about you? And we have happy meals, and we barely have the language. If you think about other cultures around the world, I remember when my daughter died, a friend of mine who was Jewish, she talked about, wearing dark clothes and ripping the lapel and these things that signified to everyone around you up to a year afterwards that you were still processing through grief. And as we encounter sadnesses, we don't have something like that as a cultural reference point. Another thing that really hangs people up and they find it really difficult, and it's part of what I teach on, is this sense of people hesitate. They think, I don't know what to say. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to say anything at all because I can't make it better. And what that stems from is this deep thought that you have to fix grief. When really, if someone in your office tells you that their partner just lost their job, nothing that you say is going to fix that in the moment. It's just crappy, and it is what it is. And what that person actually just wants to know is that they're seen and heard. And that's on the level of human interaction. You remember earlier how I said that actually the opportunity to display empathy can do a number of things for your organization, including increase productivity. And that has to do with actually how the brain functions on a neurological level. When you, like what this picture embodies, when you demonstrate care and calm to someone who is overwhelmed, even on the level of brain science, like the parts of your brain that control higher functioning, that allow you to calmly respond to emails and make sales projections and, talk with your coworkers in a pleasant manner. When you are under tremendous stress and grief and trauma, those parts of your brain actually go offline. You are functioning just out of your amygdala, which is this lower, like fight or flight sort of a function. And mammals and humans have this amazing thing called mirror neurons that actually, when you see someone else manifesting care and calm towards you in that elevated state, it actually helps bring those parts of your brain back online. When we do this for our friends, when we do this for our coworkers, we are actually helping them be able to stabilize and return to the task and presence at hand, and not by fixing them, but just by being present with them in whatever they're struggling with. Another challenge as we go about expressing empathy and care is frankly the fact that we don't know what we don't know. Each of us is firmly embedded within our own story, which means to understand or even begin to see the dynamics of someone else's story, you have to engage in an act of imagination and empathy. For me, I'm the woman in this lower quadrant. I am in a house with 6 other people, and it is not a large house. A dog, and now 4 bunnies that we just acquired within the last week and a half. It is a busy, busy house for quarantining in the midst of 2020. Which means that for me, I fantasize about alone time. The quarantine is not alone time for me. It is with everybody all the time for me. That will really be a hindrance of me trying to connect with someone who is living by themselves and they haven't been able to see people for weeks. And it will really create a rift in our understanding. Brene Brown, who is the guru of the moment, she addresses this as she describes empathy. She says that empathy is not about experiencing the same event as someone else, but it's about connecting with the emotions that underpin that event. So for me, no, I don't know what it is like to be isolated in the midst of 2020 quarantine, but I can ask myself the imaginative question of what it might be like for someone who's experiencing that. What might they be experiencing? I am not a person with black or brown skin. I do not understand what it is like to watch the protests and have it connect with generational stories of trauma and marginalization. I can ask myself what someone in that situation might be feeling. They might be feeling angry. They might be feeling overwhelmed. They might be feeling shut down. And although we haven't experienced the same thing, I have actually experienced feeling angry or shut down. And that can help lead me closer to approximating that experience. So, whether it is with the unfolding events of 2020, there are all of these barriers and reasons that it's difficult for us personally and professionally to be able to engage, but it's worth it. It matters. And this picture is an illustration. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of this parable. This guy illustrates the parable of the long spoons. And in this parable, a guide takes a man and he shows him this room. And in this room, there's this large table and there's this steaming pot of soup in the middle of the table. And everyone around the table is so obviously like they're famished, they're starving. And they all have these long-handled spoons. And it's so infuriating because they no sooner dip into the soup, but they can't get it to their mouths. And it's dribbling all over the table. And the people are angry. They're starving to death. And the guide looks at the man and he says, "This is hell." And they pause. He takes the man next to the same looking room, same layout, same pot, same long-handled spoons, except in this room, everyone is smiling and laughing and they're well-fed. And it's because the people at the table have figured out how to dip into the soup and feed one another. And the guide looks at the man and he says, This is heaven. What does that parable tell us about 2020? We are all operating in times of disruption and scarcity. And the only way that we, as a family unit, as a community, as an organization, as a country, will be moving forward is if we can learn with our limited long-handled spoons to help feed and care for one another. And empathy is central to that. So with that in mind, let me introduce you. This is one part of the wider empathy trainings that I do, but it's a way that really connects with people. I want to introduce you to a couple of avatars. Again, you have probably been this person, you have interacted with them. I would really encourage you as we go through this to engage in some introspection and ask yourself, oh yeah, do I ever fall into these behavior types? And I'll out myself. I'll let you know the ones that I'm prone to falling into. First, we have Silent Sam. Silent Sam is so personally uncomfortable with disruption. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't want to get it wrong. And so he defaults to doing nothing. And Silent Sam, if I can tell you anything, it is that you do not want to be a Silent Sam. A Silent Sams do so much damage in interpersonal settings, in organizations. I can think of a woman that I worked with, and she worked for a nationwide, big box company, and her cousin, who is as close to her as a sibling, committed suicide. She needed time off from the company, and the company even sent her flowers. She felt really great about that. But when she got back, her manager never once asked her about her cousin, never said anything. He was so personally uncomfortable. He wanted to act like it never happened. And this was so alienating to her. She said, I was on the fence, but that was the day that I decided I could no longer work there. She began planning her exit. You will lose your people if you just overlook, especially your younger generation. We'll talk in a little bit, like there were different expectations for an older generation, but people are bringing their holistic selves to the office. You need to meet them there. Okay, have you met a cheer up Cheryl before? She is always looking on the bright side. So if you tell a cheer up Cheryl, I just had to lay off a third of my staff, she will say something like, well, at least you still have a job. At least the cheer up Cheryls in my life after my daughter died sounded like, well, at least you still have Ada and Magnus, my two living children, which was true and never made me feel better. Better responses. If you are prone to being a cheer up Cheryl, instead of saying anything that begins with at least, just say, I am sorry that you are going through this. This is a great phrase just to have in your back pocket. I am sorry that you are going through this. It is not up to the cheer up Cheryls to force someone to look on the bright side, because you know what that person decides, the person who shared? They either decide that you are an unsafe person to share with, or they're forced to put on a happy face when they don't feel happy. Fix it Frank. Oh, I can totally be a fix it Frank if I'm not paying attention. Fix it Frank is really good at troubleshooting. That often leads him to an executive position because he's so good at solutions. And what he wants to jump to immediately is, well, what you need to do is, or what we should do. I mentioned these bunnies that came into my household. We had a bunny die. My daughter's bunny was killed by the dog. Bunnies can actually die of shock. I did not know this. The bunny died of shock while Jemima was at school. It was horrible. And I went into full fix it Frank mode. Like, first thing I'm doing, I'm researching new bunnies because I'm going to make it better. If I would have done that when Jemima came home, like had no time for her sadness, but just telling her, well, I've researched the new bunny and here it is, like, Fix It Frank does not make time for people just to feel their feelings. So if you are a Fix It Frank, instead of saying, have you tried that? Or you need to, or all the things that Fix It Franks do, just be willing to sit with them in the hardness. This will probably require a lot less words than Fix It Franks are used to giving. Practice saying things like, that sounds hard. It's important for Fix It Franks to table the solutions. There might be a later time for it, certainly not in the moment they tell you. Commiserating Candace. This is another type that I will be if I'm not careful, because commiserating Candace, she has her own sad story of things that have happened. And I've got some sad stories. And commiserating Candace, she is going to totally hijack the narrative with her own sad story. So, a commiserating Candace, if my Black colleague says, you know what, seeing the news about the police and the protest each night has just been so hard for me, I, as a white American, would say something like, I know exactly how you feel. I feel threatened when I walk through the streets too. I'm a woman and I feel scared at night, and I know exactly what you're feeling. A commiserating Candace, they're wanting to connect, but in jumping in with their own story, they're actually taking the conversation away from the person who's sharing. And frankly, you never know exactly what someone else is going through. Even if you have gone through breast cancer and someone shares that they have breast cancer, your experience, because of your difference in personality and circumstance, you will never know exactly what they're feeling. And maybe there's a point later on to share your same story, because again, people want to know that they're not alone, but don't do it in the first conversation. Instead of jumping in with, I had, or my sister had, and I know what you're feeling. For commiserating Candace, just practice saying this. I can't imagine what you're going through, because you can't. And then ask the question, what is this like for you? That's a great way to get more information and have it radically be about the other person and not about you. Okay, interrogating Edward. Maybe you've met this guy. He is really good at getting to the bottom of things. It's part of his skill set. He's a good question asker. He's an investigator. But when he brings that skill set to an interpersonal relation, oh my gosh, it just turns people off immediately. And you know it if you've interacted with him. Because when you tell an interrogating Edward something like, I feel overwhelmed with my kids going back to school and I'm just tired, interrogating Edward is going to jump in with something like, well, have you ever thought about learning pods? Maybe you should do a learning pod. I mean, and have you really considered all of the options? Maybe you should just have them be at home. He just keeps wanting to dig down with questions in a way that really leaves people feeling attacked and on the defensive. A better response for an interrogating Edward, instead of, I don't understand why you feel that way, or peppering them with endless questions. Again, say something like, that sounds overwhelming. And a specific tip for all types, but especially interrogating Edwards, is to really pay attention to the feeling behind the person who is expressing something. Because oftentimes interrogating Edwards are so focused on facts and trajectories that they're missing the feeling. If you are listening for feeling and you hear someone saying, I feel sad, say, that sounds sad. Just say it back to them. And I mean, it might sound really basic, but you will be amazed at the effect that will have. People will go, yeah, it was. And they will find that they are really connecting with you and thinking, that person really heard me. Joking Julie. This is a new character, but now that I've named her, I'm seeing her more and more. And again, I told you about the bunnies that died, sadly. Joking Julie comes from the real life story of what my son came back from 5th grade saying that his math teacher had said to him, because Magnus shared, the teacher said, hey, what happened over the weekend? And Magnus shared and said, my sister's bunny died. And this teacher immediately cut him off and said, no, only happy stories. And Magnus, though, he's an emotionally expressive guy, and he knew he had a story to tell. So a little bit later on in class, now he's talking one-on-one with the teacher. And he's saying, yeah, my sister's bunny died, but I still have my bunny, and my favorite bunny is a Dutch lop. And the teacher, again, cut him off and said, you know what my favorite bunny is? A dead fried bunny. And then he laughed and tried to move on to the next subject. And as I'm talking with my son, I was horrified, and I realized this is how the conditioning starts that leads to joking Julies, or another person has alternately labeled them. As I was in a training, they said, oh yeah, I've interacted with that guy. He's a jackass Jared. And these people, they are trying to close the interaction and get out of an uncomfortable situation by either making light of their own pain or making light of yours. It's a closing tool. And it's really prevalent as I've, introduced this character. There are a lot of men who identify with the pressure to be a joking Julie. Instead of whatever joke or marginalization you want to make, just say, that stinks. That's so bad. Remember that laughter is not always the best medicine. You can sit in the pain for a second. You don't actually have to change the subject on yourself or on someone else. So, some of these better responses. Finally, Buck Up Bobby. Buck Up Bobby tends to be older. It is really the dominant paradigm of my parents' generation, which is home life is separate from work life, and we are just pushing through. I can sometimes be a Buck Up Bobby, especially with my children, if I feel like they're not being resilient. A Buck Up Bobby sound like this. You say to a Buck Up Bobby, I feel exhausted by so many Zoom meetings. Buck Up Bobby will immediately say, well, that is just what needs to happen, and there's not space for complaining here. You get with the program, or you can be somewhere else. He really thinks that that's a good capacity and that he needs to stir up strength and resiliency in his people. And strength and resiliency, they can be important messages. There is a better way for a Buck Up Bobby to say this without coming across as a jerk. Instead of the explicit message of you are stronger than this, or you need to be strong, there's no place for this emotion, he can convey something a lot more in touch by saying, I have seen you get through tough things before, and I believe you will come through this. So just, by way of overview, some general tips for communicating care. Acknowledge the hardness. People want to be seen and heard. Ask leading questions or be comfortable with silence. Tell me more. And if someone is just sitting quietly, you can sit quietly with them. Sometimes silence and presence communicate more than words ever could. Remember, it is not about you, whether the person wants to talk about it or not. It is not a reflection of their relationship with you primarily, because disruption is disruptive. People don't always know what they need. Repeat what you hear. Like, listen for the emotion and say back, that sounds frustrating, angry, sad. And if you don't know what to say you don't know what to say. This is so much better than being a silent Sam. Even just the honest admission, I have no idea what to say right now. I have never had someone commit suicide in my family. I don't even know what to say, but I just want to let you know that I'm here with you. It's huge. Anything with at least is bad. It minimizes whatever the person who's sharing is saying. And perhaps you are like sitting and you're listening to this and you think, oh my gosh, I was totally a joking Julie like yesterday, and I wish I hadn't done that. I would encourage you, circle back to someone that you've missed. Like, it is meaningful. And I found myself even doing this within the last week and a half, just circling back and saying, I am really sorry. I missed you in this. I was apologizing to a family member. And I said, last year, I really wish I would have been there for you better. And that's powerful. It's good for your relationships. Avoid cliches. They've become cliches for a reason, because the phrases have been emptied of meaning. Let's just look on the bright side, or tomorrow is another day. Like, they barely have any meaning anymore. And be careful with religious language. It might be important in your story, but you don't know how that will translate. We are both what we say. We're also what we do. This is a picture of my youngest Moses when he was in preschool. I had slammed his hand in the door by accident, getting out of the car for preschool. And he did not think that he had it in him to finish out the day. He was sure that we should just chalk it up for a loss and he needed to go home. Until we walked in, and preschool teachers are awesome at meaningful gestures, because Miss Barb had a ice pack in her mini fridge and she gave it to him for his hand. And then he went to his classroom and Miss Adderley said, oh, Moses, it seems like you've had a hard morning. Why don't you sit and have snacks and you can just take all the time you need. And we as grownups are not that different from Moses. We want people to care for us. One of the big ways of doing that is just to write it down. If someone has had a parent die this year, Christmas is going to be hard for them. write it down to follow up with them. If you have someone on your team who has to be quarantined for COVID, write it down 7 days into their quarantine to send them a text or a card. I am someone who teaches this stuff. I'm full of good intentions. I will absolutely forget to do any of these things if I don't write them down. Option B, that is Sheryl Sandberg's Not-for-Profit. They have some great cards that are really attuned to the feel of 2020. You can send some of those. If someone has had, a family member die, ask and use their name. If someone has lost a job, introductions on LinkedIn. We all need to eat when we're going through hard stuff. So a meal or a grocery card is great. Some takeaways: self-care matters. Compassion fatigue is real right now. You might think I'm tired, but still reaching out, like that parable of the long spoons. You don't have to fix other people. And don't be silent. You don't have to be perfect. You will not always be perfect in reaching out to these people. But if you are trying to practice compassionate listening and responses and meaningful gestures, it will make a huge difference. This is just one part of larger trainings that I do on empathy in the workplace. This is my website, lieselmertes.com. I am also the host of a podcast where I have great guests who come and talk about disruptive life events that they have lived through. You get the uncut stuff. Like, wow, when I was dealing with alcoholism, this was stupid stuff that people said. This was great things. Those episodes are wonderful to listen to with a team. We always end with 3 key takeaways to make you a better manager, coworker, or friend. And with that in mind, that's the end of my remarks. I'd love to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, that, Liesel, that is like, wow, Liesel, that is just incredible stuff. I'm sitting here. I actually do a course and I use the acronym PRESS. And it's literally to help people, but it's the P is problem awareness, R is root cause analysis, but right in the middle, the E is empathy. And it's like, do I care enough about the problem and the people it harms? And that's just a starting place. And so what I'd love to do, and you mentioned here towards the end, I mean, you have so much stuff. I don't even know. I mean, once again, this is a replay for sure. And thank you so much for making this your life's work, because it is so needed. How important is it to be proactive and intentional? As you said, it's not just waiting for it, but like looking to be intentional, writing these things down and thinking about it. How much of a difference can that make when you turn it into a behavior of yours or something that you do intentionally and you're very proactive with this as it relates to empathy and being empathetic?
That's a great question. It makes a huge difference. This is going to be a strange connection, but the first thing I thought about was flossing. I'm in my late and like I go to the dentist. They always tell me like, hey, flossing's a really good idea. I've heard that for decades. I don't floss until I happened to be FaceTiming within the last year and a half with my sister, and she was flossing while we FaceTimed. And I was like, that looks like really easy. Maybe I can start flossing. And I started to, like, just once or twice. And just like anything else, whether exercise, like to put that intention to believe, oh, it's possible for me. I can take these steps. Empathy is like that. That's why in talking about these trainings, like just some really basic, and in other sessions, we go a lot deeper and there's deeper work. But just to say, hey, I'm not going to say at least anymore. Or I'm going to realize like this. So for me, I'm a recovering, commiserating Candace. I intentionally think as I sit there, like, don't share your own story. Like I have to be quiet way longer than is comfortable for me. The more you do those things though, and the more you see the difference it makes, you'll keep doing them. I am now a person that thinks exactly what I said, writing things down, sending a text. Like empathy actually for an individual or an organization, it is not high cost. You don't have to be super smart. You don't have to have continuing education. You just have to like take the time. I want to be the person now, like when I here's one more example. I met someone at a networking event. She just moved to Indianapolis. This was last Thanksgiving, and she was 6 months pregnant with her first child. And I mentally put it in my calendar, even though I didn't know her very well. I'm going to send her a text in February because she doesn't have any family here, and it's brand new. And I bet she'd just appreciate a text of somebody checking in. It meant the world to her, especially after COVID had hit. She was like, I can't believe, and it was the intention of in November putting something in my calendar for February and spending 30 seconds on a text. And
Wow.
that's the kind of power that stuff has. Like, it really makes an impact. And the more you just become a person who flosses or a person who does those things, like it's not even painful because you'll get so many good signals as to how it's impacted people. You will want to keep doing it.
Wow. It's a great answer. A question from Taylor is, what is the best way to relate to a coworker when you've had a similar experience without, and I know you touched on this, but without completely taking over or hijacking the narrative?
Great question, Taylor. I actually get this question a lot because, to their credit, Commiserating Candaces, they want to connect with people, and that is beautiful. It's a beautiful impulse. I would say, especially if it's a coworker, like you're in an ongoing relationship with someone, this subject will come up again. You will have a chance to share that story. Pay attention in that first interaction. Like, I coach myself to think, I want this to radically be about them. And at the end of that encounter, if you want to close, like you're getting ready to go, say, hey, if you ever want to talk more sometime, like my dad died when I was in my early 30s too. Put it out there. That person, then they can take you up on it or not, but save it for the end. And I honor the impulse of wanting to connect. It is a good impulse. It just, when it's the first thing out of your mouth, it will act against that impulse.
So honor it. So recognize that impulse. Just see it, be more alert, be more aware, right? I mean, that's so good. So how do you deal with, this is from Omar, how do you deal with a know-it-all person, I love this, that doesn't care what you want to say and knows more than your own self or what you know about yourself? Or they feel like they know more about
They're the worst, aren't they? You feel like if you say it to them, they're not going to listen because they're just going to keep pushing onward. It's hard because sometimes work puts us in proximity with those people. Like, the choice is not always to walk away. Sometimes our families of origin put us in proximity with those people. That is some of the work that I do with boundaries. You are not obligated to have to continue enduring toxic situations. If you're constantly in these feedback loops, you can say something like, I think you're trying to help me right now. Just know this is not feeling helpful to me right now. I feel overwhelmed. I need to step away. Or just even be as forthright as saying, this isn't a conversation that I want to have right now. And I hope you can respect that. Like, you don't owe someone that space.
Yeah. One of the things I like to tell people is, I'm responsible to you. I'm not responsible for you. And that should be both ways. And so we have to know the difference so that we can actually manage that for ourselves. Because you can get irate when someone does that to you. They know more about you than yourself. And I mean, we're all guilty of doing that to people sometimes, but we've got to back up and understand that space.
Well, and it stinks because sometimes, like, it is oftentimes the disrupted person. Like, you don't need the added pressure of needing to educate someone in how to be more empathetic. Like, that's not your role. Point them towards my website. Somebody could benefit from it. But man, if you are someone that has the bandwidth or is in like, man, I'm going to have another, 3 decades with my husband who keeps doing this to me, or my mother, there's also a place, if you have the bandwidth, and you don't have to do this, but to be able to say, when you do that, it makes me feel this. And then to say, is that what you're wanting to do? Because that's the effect that you're having. And again, you don't owe anyone that conversation, but especially for like long-term relationships, that can be helpful.
And I like that when you said, is that what you're wanting to do? And it's not an attack question, which is like, why do you keep doing that?
Right.
You put a person on the defensive, but the way you're creating or presenting that question you're asking, like, tell me, what do you want to accomplish by this? And I love that. Such a thoughtful answer, and very helpful. How do you approach empathy with a person who has clearly expressed they are a suffer in silence type and don't want to be consoled or receive outward demonstration of care and compassion?
Yeah. Well, deference goes to the person who is going through something hard. Like you might want to, because of sometimes for caring people, like you want to be able to care and have someone receive care and send you those signals. But especially if someone has said to you, like, please, I just want to be left alone. It's important to respect that boundary that they have put up. I remember, so I'll give you an example from a podcast interview that I did a couple of months ago. So Barry had his partner, AJ, die. It was the love of his life. It was incredibly hard. And he talked about returning to work, and he had a pretty supportive workplace, but he had this coworker that he didn't really know that well who came up, and he talked about the pain of her, like, demonstrative, like, I am so sorry. Can I give you a hug? You know, just a really big display in front of all of his fellow coworkers. And he said, like, that just felt so discordant to me. Like, I just was trying to survive the first day. I was just trying to get through. And it highlights the fact that, like, empathy is about paying attention to the other person. Even the extroverts that you know, that you think, like, man, they love to talk. They're going to love to talk. They're going to want all of that. Like, grief changes things. Like, I'm an extrovert. At my daughter's funeral, like, afterwards, there was a big gathering. I went downstairs. I talked to no one. I mean, I didn't want to interact with anybody. These were like friends. Like, people show up for your wedding and sometimes for the funeral of your daughter. And I just didn't want to see anybody. So respect that as they're going through the moment. If it's not that they're going through something hard, but that's just their view about life, and maybe they're like in a leadership position and that percolates down, they're like that buck up Bobby type. There's deeper work usually for that kind of an individual to do, because oftentimes what we project onto other people is the voice that drives us. That's probably a person who is used to suppressing their own grief and trauma and not giving it space to breathe. They expect other people to do likewise. So there is work for them to do. You probably won't do it for them. That's been some of the work I've had to do with my own inner voice. Ooh, I have a hard driving value of just achieving no matter what the feeling is. I give off that vibe to other people if I don't actually take time to be like, that's not the healthiest thing for me. That's not what I want to say to myself. It's not what I want to say to you.
Wow. How do you practice empathy without allowing it to impact your own personal mental health?
Blessings on you for the corollary question. Just this morning, I was doing a training on compassion fatigue. It is huge. Compassion fatigue is the emotional residue of exposure to other people's grief and trauma. It is really real. Almost everybody is dealing with it. I'll give you like a high level of some of the things. Like, there are some basic practices you need to, and they're like healthy living things. You know, what are ways that you can set meaningful boundaries with people? If there's someone who's really totalizing your empathy attention, to be able to say, hey, I have 10 minutes to talk with you about this. You can make it time bound. Or, I really care about what you're saying. I can't talk about it right now. How about we talk tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Like, sometimes that can bring, you know, the volume down. It also has to do with things like meaningful movement, thinking about what self-nurture looks like for you. What are the boundaries you have in place between work and home? Like, do you put your computer in a drawer at the end of the day? Do you have a purposeful pause before you engage with social media? It has to do with making sure that you actually are as healthy as you can be within all the stuff that's going on for you. Because each of us, like, everybody is dealing with grief and trauma this year, grief of unmet expectations. And some people are dealing with trauma on top of that. So we're all like in the mix. You need to be doing things so you can be healthy enough to be able to show up for other people. And when you're seeing those signs of compassion fatigue, like apathy, disrupted sleep, irritability, lack of interest in others. Like, this was me last night, because my 11-year-old and 13-year-old had so drained me by the end of the day. This is absolutely true. My husband was out I laid on the floor listening to music and just praying and thinking, I don't know if I can like do another day like this. Like you need to take, and I was breathing, I was doing the deep, I made myself some tea and a cookie. I felt a little bit better, but compassion fatigue is real. It's a great question. There's a whole other training on it because it's that important.
No, and I think that's very important but we need to be aware of ourselves. I mean, my big question I always ask is, I believe our emotions sometimes, they'll trigger the thinking, but then the thinking can trigger the emotion, and how it all works. But it's like the big, ice caps melting. And then next thing you know, you have the Colorado River rushing.
Right.
You don't just jump into it. So you want to know is, what am I feeling and where's this taking me? You need to like really think about it so you know how to, make those adjustments. How would you recommend coaching and educating leaders in our organizations on empathy?
That is a great question. It is a difficult dynamic to lead up. So congratulations on taking up that mantle. It's important. I mean, not to like just plug my stuff, but I do believe that workplace empathy training, like it is the skill for 2020 and moving forward. It's super important. I do executive coaching. I do a certificate program for leaders, managers, or HR directors, like anyone who is in a position of leadership. How do you make work a place that people want to go to when times are hard? And sometimes it's really beneficial. I also do cohort groups of like leaders together, because there's a way in which they can open up to some of the struggles. Like they're having to do repatterning. Like a lot of these people were brought up with a paradigm that made them successful. They believe it, they keep peddling it. And it's just like when I do role playing or workshops, people find themselves saying the same stuff that their first boss said to them, or that their uncle said when their grandmother died. Like we're just in default behaviors. So it takes intention. Point them to some of these trainings, tell them that they are going to be on the cutting edge of the hottest new workplace trends. And also, just beginning to ask the question of like, what support systems do we have in place? Lots of companies, what they have their EAP, they have a 3-day bereavement policy, and that is not cutting the mustard for 2020. Your HR department knows it. They're having to do this stuff all the time. Your leadership team knows it. As I talk with and train CEOs, like they know that they're out of their depth. They just don't know that there are resources there to help them. They think being out of their depth is just the best they can do. So
I really appreciate that, because it's about the whole person. And I think that is the wave of the future. Should have always been that way. But we need to be paying attention to the whole person. It's not just a transaction. You do the work, you get paid. We need to pay attention to the whole person. Couple more questions here. And this is so great. I'm going to your website after. I mean, this is what I do all the time and I love it. So I found me a new top choice of go-to places. How do you respond or handle a new boss who treats you like they know more than you do or are condescending to you?
Oh, that feels so bad, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's so many dynamics at play. I would want to sit down and be like, tell me more. Tell me about the structure of your organization. Does that boss have a boss that they are answerable to? All kinds of things. Again, a little bit like, what I said with a family member. You could try, and this will probably depend on some of the purview and the personality of your boss. Hey, I just want to let you know, when you say it that way, I feel this. Is that what you were wanting to make me feel like? What is the takeaway message? That sort of language, again, it's not saying like you're doing this and you're a jerk. It's opening up. And man, I use that in disagreements with my husband. I use that in workplace situations because it really gives a person a chance to backpedal, because again, sometimes they're just in these default behaviors. They're an interrogating Edward because that's what they always do in everything. And they're going to do it with you right now. So it gives them an opportunity to say, no, I don't want to, or yeah, I'd like to do better. So that's a good place to start. It's a hard problem to have.
Good way to put it. So lastly, here's the last one. Because it's not just that this is interesting, because I do believe it's interesting stuff, and some people are just now engaging this and looking at it differently. So thank you so much for such a wonderful point of view and perspective to give to people. But if they want to get started in this, if you could just give them some 1, 2, 3s on where should I start with this?
Yeah. One of the first things is to be aware of your own feelings. For lots of people, being able to pick up on the cues of other people. There's some people who are naturally empathetic, like they're intuitive people, they get it. A lot of others of us starts with paying attention to your own emotional world. I have gotten a visual cue for this year. It was an Instagram ad, and it was one of those perfectly targeted ones. Like, it's a poster that I put up in my house, and it's got primary emotions in the middle, and then it's got concentric circles of the types of emotions that you're feeling. My kids use it. I use it. Like, okay, you're not just angry, you're actually disheartened. Begin paying attention to what you're going through. Know that compassion fatigue is real. As you get into this and caring for other people, you're going to have to be making space for yourself to be refreshed. And, think back on those avatars that I said. There's probably 1 or 2 that stuck out to you.
Yeah.
And you're asking yourself, like, oh my gosh, am I a cheer up Cheryl? And like, start paying attention. And if you're feeling vulnerable, so this is like point 3 subpoint, ask someone you care about, hey, when we talk, do I often just try to like make you feel better without really listening? And take that feedback and move on from there. Also, the podcast, like I said, the Handle with Care Empathy at Work podcast, that is a great, like, really low barrier to entryway of being like, you just like look through the titles, miscarriage, suicide, divorce. That'll help you if you think there's somebody in my life and I don't know what they're going through and I'm afraid I might be stepping in it. Like, let somebody else do the talking. You can just do the learning.
This has been great. I mean, so great. And I really appreciate it. And there's so many comments in here. It's like, my goodness, when she talks, I feel empathy. It's like, there's so many wonderful, wonderful comments. And I'm sure you've heard those before. So thank you again, Liesel. This has been amazing.